Clem Sunter is South Africa's most highly regarded scenario planner and strategist, an icon and model of mental litheness, as he has been adeptly styled as the foxy futurist. An executive elite who has found a calling in developing unique and creative solutions to fit situations no longer defined in a box. A popular speaker at SAPEX's events, Clem returns to the SAPEX stage by popular demand. Ladies and gentlemen, Clem Sunter.
Good morning, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be here. I have to say that I'm feeling a bit old because when I get mentioned as somebody who spoke at a matric speech, but don't worry, you only feel old when your children look old. Yeah, there's two things she said. The fish, I remember my son caught a fish in Zoo Lake, so it wasn't a quality goldfish. It was just a little fish. And we looked after this little fish for 5 years in a bowl. We called it Elvis because it shook it, shaked itself a bit. The other thing Tanya referred to was corridor violence. I have to tell you that in Anglo in the 70s, when I was working in the chairman's office there, we didn't have meetings in a room and then corridor violence. We had corridor meetings where Harry Oppenheimer just spoke to a few of his colleagues and we bought a gold mine. And yeah, we did become the largest company in South Africa, the largest mining company in the world, and the largest foreign investor in America in 1980. So, you know, sometimes informal family approaches really work. So, yeah, she mentioned all those points about having a good supply chain. I'm going to zero in on just one. Which is the risk management side of the supply chain. I'll start by illustrating it with a story. I remember when I was chairman and CEO of Anglo's Gold Division, being rung up by the chief purchasing officer. We didn't have the word supply chain in those ideas, so we called them chief purchasing officer. And he said, "We have a problem, Clem. One of our reagents that you use on the gold mine, which is very crucial in recovering gold, unfortunately, the country that it comes from has just had a revolution." So I said, "Well, how much of our reagent comes from that country?" And he said, 100%. So luckily, we had enough stock to survive. Switching to an alternative source, but you know, it just showed that there are huge risks in the supply chain, and of course now that they're much more complicated, the risks are much higher. I was just talking to the Boeing guy before the presentation, and I mean they have the record, or I think that either first or second in the number of people or companies that supply components to Boeing from around the world and the number of countries that they deal with. And of course, every one of those countries has a risk profile which you have to consider when you decide how much of your supply you're going to give to that country, and of course, monitoring it afterwards. So what's the methodology to do precisely that? Well, I wrote a book with a young woman called Chantal Ilbery in 2000, and it was published in June 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. And we called it that because foxes have two qualities which we think that people who are involved in risk management, in fact, any company executive should have. You have to have very bright eyes to pick up any changes in the environment around you that could affect your business, and then you've got to have the agility of a fox to respond to the challenges posed by the changes in the environment. When the book first came out in June 2001, It didn't do that well, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit, and it was the best-selling book of any title in South Africa in 2002. And in 2003, it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. So what was the event that propelled it into the bestsellers? It was 9/11, because what we decided to do in the book was publish a formal letter to George Bush, in which we said that part of his legacy as President of the United States would be the way that he handled threats and how foxy he was in handling those threats. And we said in the letter his number 1 threat at the time was a massive terrorist strike on an American city, which would completely transform his presidency and possibly lead America into a gilded cage where it went internal, and it certainly didn't have the same openness with the rest of the world that it used to. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world prior to 9/11 in 2001 that in a formal letter, not fiction, formal letter, said, "This is your biggest threat." Now, why did we say that? It's because we had 3 flags that we had identified as foxes that made this a huge threat. Number 1 was the growing competition between the major religions of the world, which began in the late 80s and intensified in the 1990s. The second was the growing sophistication of groups dedicated to the downfall of America in places like Afghanistan in the mid-90s. But for us, the most clear indication of the threat was the fact that Americans themselves were having a lot to do in the Middle East, which wasn't considered constructive by the people there. And then it happened. And the point is this, is we didn't know that it would happen 3 months after we published the book. We didn't know that it would happen in New York. Those kind of precise details need inside information. But we might have changed the way the real flags were perceived if we'd actually made a presentation to the FBI or the CIA, because there was a young woman in the FBI who in 6 occasions said to her boss, "There's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." Big clue. But it was ignored on the grounds that Arabs were too incompetent to attack Americans on American soil, which is precisely the kind of scenario that, as a good fox, identifying the flags that you can play as a plausible scenario. So overnight, we became quite big celebrities in the United States, and to this day, we do a lot of work there. Chantal actually goes there. I do webinars regularly with American and Canadian audiences, talking about this methodology. I just did one the other day for the Royal Institute of Risk Management in Montreal, and they had 3,000 people connected to obviously to their hub in Montreal. And I did the presentation I'm giving you today. So it's all about the flags, and it's all about what scenarios can flow out of the flags. I'll give you a second example. In April 2006, I was invited by the Chinese Communist Party to show them the methodology at the Central Party School outside Beijing. It's the inner sanctum of the party. It's their leadership academy for anybody who is going to make it to the top in China. And they wanted to understand how to use this methodology because the school where I was lecturing writes the 5-year economic plans for China. And they said, let's use this. I mean, not just you giving us a talk, let's look at a scenario. And they said, the one thing we're really worried about is an American crash. We own $1.5 trillion worth of American bonds, and we're just worried that the American economy may be overheating. And so we wrote a crash scenario for America in April 2006. But I said to them, that's all very well, but you've got to have a flag that would indicate to you that the probability of this scenario is increasing. and we had a discussion, and they came up with the flag, which was property prices in America. They said if property prices start falling in America, the average consumer, he or she, their biggest asset is their house, and if their house starts falling in value, then they will stop spending. And since consumer spending is 2/3 of the American economy will go into reverse. Notice that they didn't get the real flag, which was subprime mortgages, because they hadn't a clue about that. But they got a very good flag, because in the last quarter of 2006, the Case-Shiller index, which measures property prices in America, leveled out after 20 years of rising every single month. And then in the first month of 2007, it started falling, and it fell for 6 months in a row. So by June 2007, they were giving an 80% probability to an American crash, even though the American markets were still rising. They only started falling in September 2007. And then with the collapse of banks in America, they obviously jumped to 100% on the scenario. It would become reality. So it is a very nice way of handling risk management, particularly in a supply chain sense. It's a simple process. We use it in Anglo. I'm still a non-executive director of Anglo American, and we use this technique to look at risks around the world. So what are the kind of risks that are raised by our clients? You know, when we do strategic conversations with them, and I'll handle the global risks first, and then I'll talk about South Africa. Well, number one, sadly, in the world, which is raised by most companies that we do work for, is the religious flag. The fact that even now, you have these terrible events like what happened in London a few days ago, Manchester, Paris, wherever it is. It's not an existential threat to the West, but it is very nasty, and it certainly changes the psychology of nations. And yes, I personally believe that that flag is only going to start coming down when America and its allies start developing a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, because unfortunately the Middle East itself is probably in the darkest space it's been in, well, since I was born. And yeah, one of the reasons is that all the wars that are going on, which has turned Syria into a basket case. It certainly has not meant Iraq improving its prospects, and Afghanistan goes on being pretty dodgy. Yemen is a disaster. It's a terrible place, and all Donald Trump has done with his huge arms deal with Saudi Arabia is to polarize the place even more, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and of course Qatar has just now been thrown out by Saudi Arabia and others. So you've got a lot of division now in the Middle East. Probably from a supply chain point of view, the only thing about this flag is to consider whether the flag is flying in any of the countries that you're doing business with, just to make sure that you watch that flag in case supplies are going to be disrupted in any way by that particular flag. The second flag we call the red flag, and it's raised particularly by our European clients. It's the flag of Russia, which really started rising with its annexation of the Crimea, as a result of which Russia got thrown out of the G8. It's now the G7, and there are sanctions against Russia from Europe and America. And Russia supplies 25% of Europe's energy. 25% of Europe's energy comes out of Russia. So obviously Russia is much more significant to Europe than it is to America. Again, despite all the talk of friendship between Trump and Putin, I would say that relations are still very tricky between America and Russia. And of course, there is an existential threat that if they ever come to conflict, you might have the next world war, because obviously it would involve nuclear weapons. The second flag, part of the flag of the red flag, is China. You know, if you look up on the internet, GDP in purchasing power parity terms, not in dollar terms, in purchasing power parity terms, China is now the #1 country in the world. It's ahead of the United States. It's ahead of Europe. And, you know, it's interesting, every century has its country. In the 19th century, it was Britain. 20th century, America. The 21st century belongs to the Chinese. And we're going to have to get used to it as a country, as a business. By the end of this century, China will be the most powerful nation on earth, well ahead of America. It's like America overshadowing Britain. China will overshadow America by the end of this century. And how much do people know about Chinese mentality, the way they work, the way they do business? And yet, it's going to be critical for many businesses and obviously critical for the supply chains of many businesses who already import stuff from China. So it's an incredibly important flag to watch. The third part of the flag is North Korea, and the fact that you have a young guy who's in charge of North Korea who basically has built his whole life around developing nuclear weapons and developing missiles so that he can actually threaten any country he wishes, including America. That's his whole existence. And the idea that you will be able to negotiate peacefully with North Korea to drop its nuclear development program, I think is very, very much beyond belief. It's not like Iran. Iran did a deal with America. I don't think North Korea is. And so it's obviously something you have to watch if you are supplied from South Korea, because the first thing North Korea will do if America attacks it will go for Seoul. And Seoul is only 56 kilometers below the DMZ border. And yeah, South Korea is one of the major players around the world, and it has this major risk hanging over it. Again, it's rather like 9/11. I can't tell you the day that it will happen or how it will happen, but it is a risk, and that's the whole point of having it on your radar screen so that you can make a judgment as to how much of your supplies can currently come from South Korea, given this particular risk. The third flag, which we call a clockwork flag, because it's ticking away. The first two flags are cloudy. They're like clouds. They change in shape every day. But the third flag is a clockwork flag, and we call it the grey flag. It's the aging of the world's population. I'll give you one statistic. In 1900, the average lifespan of an American was 47 years, 1900. By the end of the century, it was 83 for men, 86 for women, as a result of reducing the number of infant births, and secondly, keeping old people alive because of medical advances. And this has had enormous consequences for the global economy that really aren't talked about that much. In America, this whole thing about Obamacare being replaced by something else is an incredible political issue because of the number of old people in America. And if they're now going to be denied health coverage and they're going to die, Trump faces a huge problem. And yet, this flag has really hit Europe and Japan because they are the most aging societies on Earth. Italy now has a declining population. Japan has a declining population. And Japan, which is the oldest country on Earth, has a flat economy. Cheap money is not going to help them. Old people don't eat as much. They don't do anything as much. And yeah, it's the new economic model for much of the world's economy, flat, because of the grey flag. America is still a young and resilient economy because it's got much more generous immigration policies, probably not now, but up till now. And so America is a very resilient economy and will probably grow at 2 to 3% per annum, whereas Europe and Japan are going to be stuck at 0 to 0.5%. China is really feeling the effect of this flag, and that's why they've just changed their one-child policy to a two-child policy, because it's only going to affect them in the next 15 years' time. But right now they have a slowing economy, and it's because of the grey flag. They have this middle-aged bulge. They have fewer young people and obviously fewer very old people, but they have this middle-aged bulge, and it's leading to slower growth in their economy. Elsewhere in the world, like Africa, we have much younger populations, and providing you have good government, and that is a very big proviso, you have much higher economic growth rates in those countries because they have younger populations. So it is a very important flag ticking away in the background. The fourth flag, Chantal and I call the anti-establishment flag. It's the fury that the middle class has for the super rich. And it's been there for the last 5 years. And it's because ever since the crash in 2007, the middle class have not had any improvement in their lifestyle. Indeed, a lot of them have been retrenched, and equally their salaries and wages in real terms are flat. And the super rich are just getting richer because the stock markets around the world are improving. And this has caused a fury, particularly with the politicians in Washington, in Whitehall, in Canberra, that, politicians are just part of the establishment too. And of course, it's produced certain flags. Trump. He came out of nowhere. He came out of nowhere. And to be honest, he's a disaster. He is a disaster. I mean, the latest tweet on the Mayor of London is absolutely ridiculous. The guy is just, he doesn't behave like a president. And I think that now there's another scenario, impeachment, raising its head. But there it is. But in the UK, I was there. Brexit. Why did Brexit happen? Brexit happened because the North voted against the South in England. Because the North has lost its manufacturing, people are struggling in the north of England, and they look at all those rich Londoners and they say, up yours. And I think this election this week is going to be very interesting. But obviously, these are incredible flags from a supply chain point of view, because what Trump has done is he started a whole protectionist world. I mean, I did this recent seminar with these Canadians I was talking about earlier, and they say one of the biggest risks now is the future relationship between Canada and America, because most Canadian companies import a lot of their components from America, and Trump is basically saying we're no longer going to have a common market between Canada and America. Brexit has produced the same concern in London and elsewhere about what the heck do we do with our supply chains, and what do we do in terms of marketing our products and services between Europe and London if Brexit goes ahead. These are incredible uncertainties which have to be analysed according to our methodology of identifying the flags and considering the possible scenarios, and there, most importantly, what are the implications for your business, and then saying, what are we going to do about it? Very, very important. The last flag is another clockwork flag. It's ticking away in the background. We call it the green flag of climate change. We are seeing some very unusual weather patterns, and here in the Western Cape, we certainly are seeing this with the drought. And to say that it's suddenly come along is absolutely ridiculous. If you look at the minimum of our dams since 2002, which always occurs in May, the minimum has gone down every single year since 2002 to where it is today, which is 20%, but in real terms, 10%. There is that trend, and there's two things that have contributed to that trend. Population growth in the Western Cape, and secondly, the fact that climate change, making the planet hotter, is also altering the highs and lows in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, and unfortunately the lows now have a trajectory that goes south of Cape Town. And those lows still give plentiful rain, but it's plentiful rain in the ocean. And so, yeah, we face very, very tough times in the Cape because of this flag, and we're going to have to monitor it, and we're going to have to come up with solutions. And I wrote an article in January for News 24. What if the taps run dry? And the chances then were much lower than they are now. And I don't think people have considered what actually happens if the taps run dry, because you only know what happens when they do. And it could cause a lot of chaos. So it is a very important flag. It is changing the consequences for different countries. Trump has just pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which has to be one of the most insane things to do, because actually America, with many of its cities, is pushing the technological edge of smart energy systems, and it's just unfortunately put America in the same category as North Korea. So yeah, it is not a good thing. What are the scenarios generally that flow out of those 5 flags? Well, it's a low growth world in terms of its economy. We're not going to see another boom until there is another technology. It's technologies that create booms. I mean, there was a Russian economist called Mr. Kondratiev, and in the sort of turn of the last century, he said that's what creates booms, and he talked about steel creating a boom in the 19th century, followed by the railways, followed by electricity, followed by the internal combustion engine, and then he died. But since then, we've had plastics, and microelectronics, and then, of course, microelectronics contributing to smart devices. And now we need the next technology. And the most significant things to come out in recent talks, and this is where Shell better start playing scenarios, is that by 2025, 2030, the internal combustion engine will be obsolete. That is the latest thinking coming out of the United States, that everybody will be driving electric cars by then, and they will be driverless. So you can't have an argument. No more road rage. Well, of course, you could have between the two software systems. But that's one. And then the second is smart energy, solar energy, and making your house self-sufficient in energy through the solar paneling you have on your roof. There are possibilities, but that is the flag that will lift the world economy out of its current hard times. But you can make money, don't worry. As businesses, you can make money in hard times, providing you have all the characteristics that Tanya put in that circle. That's what you need, particularly innovation, if you want to make money. So what about South Africa? What are the flags that the South African CEOs have raised with us? Number one, corruption. The saga continues. Every week you open the Sunday Times, there's a new story. And what actually amazes me is that nobody has sued the press. I mean, mean, crikey, I would have sued. But nobody has sued the press, but equally nobody has taken anybody to court. However, having said that, it is a pink flag. It's not a red flag, corruption, because of the pushback. The pushback is huge. The pushback is media freedom. It is social media. And it's the fact that in the local elections last year, the ANC lost 3 major cities. So this idea that the public don't listen is not true. They certainly listened in the municipal elections last year. So this country has amazing pushback against corruption, and so it's a game in progress. I don't know necessarily what the scenario is going to play out to be, but it is a dynamic. The second flag is an equally important flag. It's the quality of our infrastructure and education. You know, when I did this session with the Chinese Communist Party in 2006, they said in 1978 we were the 100th economy in the world. Today we're number 2, and by the 2030s we'll be number 1 in the world. And they say part of that has been the incredible infrastructure development of China between 1978, when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao Zedong, and now. And it is true, China has an incredible infrastructure. I've done work in India, and India, I think, is more entrepreneurial than China, but unfortunately, they simply haven't got the infrastructure that China has. And in this country, if we want a 3 to 5% economic growth rate, we're going to have quality infrastructure, particularly in urban areas. And driving here from Somerset West this morning, I've now realized just how packed our roads are on the way here. And we're going to need more infrastructure if we're going to overcome all the traffic jams that you encounter in the Cape Town metropolitan area. And of course, we look at the state of a lot of our parastatals and the battles on the board and the kickbacks that people are getting. You can't have that, not in an economy growing at 3 to 5%. You can't afford it because you need that quality infrastructure so that all the businesses represented in this room can actually do business and grow their business. Quality education. Tanya's referred to that, about you need to give people the skills. We had a wonderful breakfast talk which said the same thing. It all comes back to the quality of education, which is not the amount of money you throw at it. It's about holding the teachers accountable, and if they don't perform, chucking them out. I personally believe that every state school should have local community representatives on the parents' court council, and they should be able to vote about staff appointments, because I did enough work in the Anglo Chairman's Fund to realize that the principal variable of a school is the principal. You have a good principal, the school does well. You have a bad principal, the school does badly. And it applies to the good schools and the bad schools. So, you know, this quality of infrastructure flag is a very important flag in our country. The third flag is around leadership and developing an inclusive leadership, because we have to perform as one team. In today's very competitive economic world, you have a divided team, you have no chance. I always use the example of Alex Ferguson and Manchester United. When he was in charge of the team, they won every single trophy on earth, so many times that they became the global leader. He left, and they won nothing, except they did win the Europa, the championship trophy, which is possibly the first step back for Man United. But I support Chelsea. And we won the Premier League. But now, here's the story. Last year, when Mourinho fired that female doctor in the first game that Chelsea played, because she ran on in extra time to help Eden Hazard, who'd been injured, And he then had an altercation with her on the sidelines. I said, that's it, that's a flag. There is no way Chelsea will win the league this season because he's made the team divided. And so it is very, very important that you have leadership which brings this country together. I had the extraordinary privilege of seeing Nelson Mandela in prison because he'd read one of my books. And so off I went to Victor Verster, and he was already in a little cottage there. And yeah, he gave me 5 hours of his time, and we intensely debated the future. He even gave me lunch. And he blew me away with his spirit of reconciliation, which he certainly showed when he became president of this country. And unfortunately, right now, we're a very divided country, and we do need that coming together. Not that white people have to make some very hard choices in terms of creating what I call an entrepreneurial economy. I'm going to come on to that. So please, I'm not saying things should stand still, but you do need that incredible kind of inclusive spirit for our country to compete on the global stage. And so the flag is who's going to be the next leader of the ANC, and then who is going to be the next leader of the country. The fourth flag is around pockets of excellence, because it is just like soccer teams. You need stars, and in countries you need stars. That's how countries get on the map. That's why South Korea is now one of today's most important economies, because it has Samsung. America, we all know about Apple and all the other stars in America. And when people say what in the long run creates the destiny of a country, it's not the presidents, not the presidents. They are there to make sure the platform is there. You've got to have the entrepreneurs. I mean, Henry Ford was incredible. So was Walt Disney. So was Bill Gates. So was Steve Jobs. And now, ironically, the #1 entrepreneur in the United States, according to Forbes, is a South African, Elon Musk, educated at Pretoria Boys High. Woo! And there he is, #1 in America. And we need the same people, and we do have them. I mean, we have lots of incredible entrepreneurs in South Africa. Adrian Gore has changed the whole health game in the UK. Everybody's running, putting what was it? Something before mattress. Mind over mattress, there you go. Everybody in the UK puts mind over mattress because they're given a financial incentive to go to the gym. And it was Adrian Gore who actually did that. So, you've got to have those pockets of excellence. We have lots of pockets of excellence in South Africa in the private sector. We also have pockets of excellence in the government sector. And we've got to replicate those pockets of excellence. What we mustn't do is dumb them down. That would be a very red flag. And the last flag is the most important one of all, entrepreneurial spark. If you consider how technology, and apparently you had a lecture yesterday on what technology is doing to the world of work, well, the one thing it's certainly doing is making sure that big businesses no longer hire people like they did in the last century. When I was young, you just got a good CV by getting good matric results, good university degree, woof, waved your CV, you got a job. Nowadays, that's no longer true. Ask any young person, because a lot of those traditional jobs have been destroyed by technology. And so you want to create 5 million jobs in South Africa, we've got to create 5 million new businesses, or at least 1 million new businesses with 5 people. But the total priority in this country should be the support and nurturing of small business. It shouldn't be a sideline, it should be absolutely center stage, because in that triple thing of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, the only way you're going to sort out unemployment is through creating an entrepreneurial economy. In America, they've got an unemployment rate of 4.3% now. It's very, very low. And it's because, as Bruce Whitfield said when he went to Warren Buffett's AGM in Omaha, most people in Omaha have 3 jobs. They do a bit of Uber, then they serve in the local cafe, and then they do this. And that's how they survive. And that's how a lot of Americans survive now. And you know, it's maybe not like having a unionized job, but that's the way work is going in the world. And unfortunately, you can't control the flag. Once it starts going up, you have to adapt. And so it is critical that if we want a decent future, we're going to have to do that. And I've actually just written an article for News 24 called The Heart of a National Democratic Revolution, because that lies at the heart of the revolution, is that we really put the entrepreneur at the center. And it's bottom up. It's not top down, it's bottom up. That's the way you can create a new revolution in South Africa. So what are the scenarios flowing out of this? There are three. We stay in the Premier League of Nations. We've been in the Premier League of Nations, for the last 100 years, because we've been the premier economy in Africa. In fact, we've been the premier economy in Africa for the last 150 years. But unfortunately, that position is now being challenged by Egypt and Nigeria. And we've got to do a lot of things to maintain that status that keeps us in the Premier League. The second scenario is that we just gradually decline into the second division because of the internal divisions and conflict. And we just quietly get forgotten about, and people invest in other countries in Africa, but they don't invest in our country. The third scenario is really the most sinister one. It's where public violence completely overwhelms everything else, and we move into becoming a failed state, rather like Syria, and there are other countries with very high degrees of violence where nobody even thinks of doing business because they don't want to risk their lives in those countries. Now, at the moment, we give a very small probability, maybe 10%, which maybe somebody feel is quite high, to the failed state scenario because of the fact that we are now a mature democracy. And yes, we do see local demonstrations about local municipal matters, but actually, in ordinary South Africa, below the political level, you know, people get on with each other, they get on with the work. We don't have the religious flag in South Africa and all that. So we think that at the moment it's a low probability scenario, but we put it on the table so that you can watch the flags that might create it, one of which is the level of public violence. Not so much crime, but public violence. The other two scenarios, Premier League, Second Division, are in play. And unfortunately, at the moment, because of our downgrading, which I have to say has had absolutely no impact on the rand, everybody thought that when we got downgraded, the rand would fall to, 14, 15, 16 to the dollar. In fact, it's stronger, which means that the world knows something that we don't about South Africa. And so, I would now give a 50-50 between the Premier League and the Second Division. But the whole point of the back end of my talk is that we've got to turn those flags green. If we want to increase the probability of the Premier League scenario, we've got to turn those flags green. I'd like to end with a story that will leave you on a high. I was the chairman of the Anglo Scholarship Panel for 25 years, and we interviewed the brightest students in South Africa for one open scholarship to university. And in 2008, we interviewed a very bright guy. And he was called Siyabulela Zuza. And he absolutely blew us away. And we awarded him the scholarship. And he chose Cape Town to do chemical engineering. And I met him 3 months later at Johannesburg Airport and said, "Hi, Sia, how are you?" He said, "Gee, Mr. Sunter, I'm very well." I said, "How's UCT?" He says, "Oh, you haven't heard?" I said, "No." So he said, "Harvard have given me an open scholarship so you can have your scholarship back." So he's been to Harvard. He's finished with Harvard. He's blown the lights out at Harvard. In his second last year, he was the official guest of NASA and shown around the entire facility with two other special guests, Barack and Michelle Obama. So he's recognized in the United States for the work that he's been doing on rocket fuel. He's made a significant contribution to increasing the energy in rocket fuel. And he's now back here in South Africa. He's created his own business, and hopefully he's going to make a success of alternative energy systems. But that, for me, is the pocket of excellence that we require to make our country really great. I'm not going to say great again, because if I say that, I'll be thought of as Trump. So just great. So I really hope that I've got it into you that absolutely critical part, apart from all the other points that Tanya made, of being a good supply chain manager is to identify the flags related to each of the products or services that you purchase for your company, and what obviously the technology flags as much as the country flags, as much as any other flags. It's the specific flags that you should be watching around that particular thing. And then obviously thinking of what the possible scenarios could flow out of those flags, and then assessing the probabilities around them. That is the best way to go around risk management. And I'd like to leave you with a benediction for all of you in this room and the companies you represent, and obviously SAPEX itself, which does a great job. May the fox be with you. Thank you.